What if the best life leadership and self-discovery lessons you've ever imbibed weren't mixed in a boardroom or a backyard, but distilled in a barrel or brewed in a backyard? What if the secret to patience, precision, and transformation is hiding in your pint glass right now or a slowly aging cask? In this Uncork episode, we're cracking open the world of beer and whiskey, my favorite worlds, not just to sip, but to search deep inside of. We're going to dive deep into fermentation, distillation, and the blend of pressure and time that crafts something bold, unforgettable, and fully alive. Life and leadership, like brewing and distilling, requires intention, discipline, curiosity, and the courage to wait for depth to develop. Keep listening. You should keep listening if you're ready to chase that kind of aroma and raise a glass to everyone who knows that greatness, like a magnificent whiskey or brewski, is never rushed, but always refined by time and effort. Hey, my friends, welcome back to the Uncommodified podcast. I'm Tim Windsor, and today my guest on the show is Matt Howell. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
That's going to be fun. Now, a bit about Matt and how we met. So Matt is the Vice President of Operations and Head Distiller at Collective Arts Brewery. He's a trained microbiologist with a master's degree in brewing and distilling. Matt has elevated the art and craft of brewing and distilling at Collective Arts with his colleagues since 2015, guiding operations, quality, and packaging across multiple award-winning brands. Matt is also the pour master. I invented this term for you, Matt. Pour
I like it.
master, not P-O-R, but P-O-U-R, the pour master at Saint Howell Tastings, where Matt transforms every sip into a story, hosting intimate guided tastings of beer, scotch, and other spirits, which Matt will be doing for me and 19 guests at a private Scotch tasting experience this summer on August 22nd, 2025, about a month from the time that this podcast goes live. And I bid and won this event, this experience at a charity auction. And that's how I met Matt along the way. And at the end, listeners, here's going to be something for you. You could be one of those 19 people who joined Matt and I at my home for this tasting. And I'm going to tell you how later on. I'm going to leave that for later. But of course, this is an uncork conversation, a true uncork conversation, because we're going to uncork something to drink and then talk about making drinks. This is good, Matt. I love it. What are you drinking tonight, my friend?
I'm enjoying a 16-year-old Glenlivet from the Scotch Malt Whiskey
Oh,
Society. Really nice. Ex sherry finished whiskey. So it should be nice.
gotta like that. Now, listen, funny enough, we didn't rehearse this, but I got a 16-year-old as well.
Oh, no
I got
way.
my favorite 16-year-old, a
Oh,
16-year-old Lagavulin.
that's great. Well,
Oh my gosh.
we'll share bottles. That one's mine there, but that
Oh, I love that.
Lagavulin one of my favorites by
Oh,
far.
I love it. Here, cheers to you, my friend.
You too. Cheers.
Mm, mm. Oh. My son and I did a Scotch trip in 2021, I believe, June. And we went to Isla for almost a week, and we just
Mhm.
toured around the distilleries. We hired a private driver. His name was Duncan. The guy was an electrician for all the Diageo properties, so he knew everybody. It was awesome. And one of the best tours we did was at Lagavulin, and we bought a 26-year-old distiller edition to bring home. But it
Oh.
was a delightful trip, and so I do like the Lagavulin, that is for sure. It's pretty awesome stuff. I can't imagine life without it. So, Matt, we're gonna get into this conversation now. And so here's a question. So why did you find yourself in this world? It's a little non-traditional world. So why
Mhm.
did you find yourself here? And what at the end of the day do you see that distilling, the process of distilling either a great beer or the whiskey distilling process or a clear spirit, what does this teach us about life and maybe leadership and ourselves? That's kind of what I'm interested in, of course, because there's got to be some major lesson in all this drinking I'm doing, Matt. Come on.
Okay. So I'll give you the background of where, how I got to be where I am. I I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Guelph, and I really enjoyed microbiology and what I studied. And I always knew I wanted to kind of continue that, continue to utilize what I had learned there, but do
Yeah.
something fun. I had many other job experiences labs at medical facilities, research facilities, things like that just weren't my thing. And it just so happened in third year when I was there, I had a housemate that got a job at Sleeman's, and so that kind of got me thinking. And I realized, hey, microbiology and beer and spirits really go well together. They kind of you really need to have a strong microbiology kind of background in order to be a good brewer or distiller. And the other aspect of that is I always wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do a postgraduate degree, and I did some research and I found I could do that in brewing and distilling as well. And found there were three schools at the time when I went to school. There were three main schools that offered postgraduate degrees. There was one in Berlin called von Stephan. There was UC California Davis, and then there was Harriet Watt University in Scotland. And so applied to all three and got accepted. And I was like, well, when's the next time I'm going to be able to go to school in Scotland and live there for a year? So kind of that got me there. And then while I was there, I was lucky enough to get a part-time job at a facility called the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, which
Yeah.
is a private members club that specializes in single cask strength whiskey. So it really gave me access to a lot of really unique whiskeys, a ton of variety. Like, and at any one time behind the bar, there were, 300 to 400 different bottlings. And, you had to know, what was in each bottle, certain flavor characteristics, because people would come to you at the bar and be like, what I want a whiskey that has a plum taste to it, or something that's not too smoky, or something's old. And so you had to pick those bottles out and describe it to them and tell them why they like it. And so it kind of really built my palate up there. And that's really kind of what I love about it's about spirits and beer and fermentation technology. And what I do kind of for a living is, it's twofold. It's the uniqueness of it. It's the variety. There's always tons of stuff out there. People make their own kind of styles. There's different terroirs to, Scotch whiskey as well. Not necessarily the same terroir as you would see with wine, but there's the different regions and they all have their specific styles, and there's kind of typical reasons for things like that. The other, on top of that, and to kind of answer the second part of your question, kind of what distilling and fermentation teach me, and what I hope they teach others about life is patience.
Mm.
Think about whiskey. Whiskey is, especially Scotch whiskey probably has the longest age requirements out of any of the kind of brown or aged spirits out there. And, there's a reason for that. It's the environment. It's cool. And, that patience really kind of rewards you when you try a nice whiskey. Like, especially when you compare it to some of the other brown spirits, like bourbons and rums are outstanding, but there's a certain quality to Scotch that, 8 to 12 or 16 years in a cask, just, you can't compare it to anything else. So,
No, you can't. And so again, listen, if you're listening in, I always say you're listening for a reason. So you might not be a partaker in the spirits, and that's okay. But I think there's some lessons that you're going to learn, and you're already hearing that, because there is a wonderful patience that's required when you set down a spirit or an investment for so long to be able to recoup. Obviously, when we're talking about, distilled spirit, and then we're putting it in a cask, so we're trying to figure out where it's going to go, which is really a fascinating science to me. Obviously, I'm not an expert in this, don't know the science, done lots of tours, so I think I know lots, Matt, but I don't know anything. So let's talk about let's dissect the conversation in two parts. Let's talk about brewing beer, and let's talk about distilling spirits, and we'll talk about these aged spirits, and we'll come back to that. So you come back, you've had this experience in Scotland. It's all around aged spirits, and now you come back, and somehow you find yourself into the beer
right.
brewing industry. So let's talk about that. So what attracts you to go from where you were to into the beer business? And let's talk about your journey there, and what that sort of the nuance of that and how it's different.
Yeah, the beer, what drew me to the beer business initially, to be quite honest, is there wasn't much of a spirit industry, or craft spirit industry in Canada when I came back. Like, there were distilleries here, but there really wasn't much opportunity for me to take advantage of that. And I'm from Kitchener originally, and kind of wanted to kind of move back to the area close to my family. And so the opportunity that was here was really around beer. I always kept an eye out for spirit related employment or opportunities, and that's kind of where I jumped on the the tasting side of things, and took advantage of that and grew that business to what it was, or to what it is. Um, but beer was really my passion. And I just kind of I stuck at it. You know, I made sure I learned as much as I could within the companies that I worked at, and you know, took advantage of opportunities that were given to me, and kind of have got to the position I'm in right now, right? And it's you know, running the operations at a at one probably the largest craft breweries in Canada. So
Yeah, you do. You know what? And what I love about Collective Arts too, it's got. I mean, you guys brew really great beer, but also the whole the arts part of it, and the way you guys look at your packaging and and supporting the artistic world and all the stuff that goes into that, which is really quite fascinating.
mm.
So here's a question I have about the difference between brewing beer and distilling a spirit. So in this case, is the general process of fermentation, is it generally the same, or is it different in those two worlds?
And you know, in general, the process of producing a beer versus producing a spirit is the same. At least the front half of distillation, right? So to produce a whiskey, let's say, you know, you take grain, you grind it up, you mix it with water, you create a mash, which is basically like a thick porridge where you're breaking down the starches that are present in the grain into simpler sugars the yeast can ferment. And then, you know, once that mashing process is done, you're taking that mash and you're putting it into a lauter tun, which is a big sieve, to separate out those the liquid portion, which is the wort, and removing it from the solid portion, which is the spent grain. And then that wort, from that stage, it kind of varies from beer to, that's where it kind of splits off from beer to spirits. You know, uh, with with spirits, typically what you'll do is you might boil it at that point to sterilize the wort. But in other distilleries, all they'll do is they'll collect that wort and they'll put it into a fermenter, and they'll ferment that. And then once the fermentation is done, they basically have a beer. It's got no hops in it. It's but you could essentially classify it as a beer. They take that finished beer and they distill it. So they're basically concentrating down that alcohol. Um, Going back to beer though, like once you're collecting that wort, you're boiling it, you're adding hops. You know, you're trying to remove a lot of the solids that are present in the wort just to kind of clarify it a bit, and then you're fermenting it, and you can, you know, there's a whole list of things you can do to the beer once fermentation is happening, and so that's how you kind of differentiate the two. But quite honestly, like they're hand in hand, kind of the same things. It's just, you know, whiskey is really just a concentrated version of a beer.
Okay, interesting. And so at some point when the fermentation process is happening, we're introducing, and is it enzyme? What are we introducing? Yeast, I guess. We're
There's a
introducing something that starts
yeah.
to activate, and it starts to come alive and
Mhm,
grow.
mhm.
And that's part of the process, which is kind of interesting. So how do you control that? And is there can it get out of control?
Yeah, oh no, for sure. Like, you know, when you know when we talk about fermentation, fermentation is basically yeast consuming sugars in the absence of oxygen and producing CO2 and alcohol. So, you know, it's a living organism. It does its thing, and it reacts to the environment it's in. We control it typically by, you know, there's a number of factors, you know, the amount of yeast that's added, the amount of oxygen that's added at the start of fermentation really kind of dictates how fermentation will progress. You know, the temperature of the fermentation will really dictate what happens, uh you know, as well, you know, what nutrients are present. You know, fermentation is a reaction, is the yeast consuming the sugar, but there does need to be a certain amount of nitrogen present in order for the yeast to appropriately function. You know, just like us, we can't just eat candy and you know, stuff, all sweet things all day. But you know, yeast is the same thing. We need to balance. We need to have kind of that balanced diet. Um, and then, you know, other things you add uh to the beer during fermentation also play a big role. You know, in some breweries and distilleries, you know, you get secondary sugar additions, or you know, in the case of some spirits, you may get a spirit addition actually to the fermentation to halt fermentation near the end. And so there's a number of factors. It's interesting. Uh, Brewing and distilling are very while they seem a little simple, they are quite complicated processes, and things can go awry. Uh, but there is a bit of an art to it too, right? It's amazing some of the recipes we've designed at Collective Arts and what's gone into them and how they've turned out.
It's fascinating. So, what on average, how long does it from start to finish? How long does it take to make a beer that you guys would make?
Anywhere between, well, if we're most of the products we produce, uh, they typically take anywhere between a week to 6 weeks. And it's really dependent on the yeast, the type of yeast we use. A bit of it has to do with some secondary additions we make. So like if we dry hop or if we do any fruit additions. But that's the big one. Extrapolating from that, we do have a big line of barrel aged products. So those ones take up to a year to finish, right? So there's a large breadth of kind of time spans in terms of how long things take.
Okay, so just to clarify, so you take some beer and you barrel age that beer.
Mhm.
What
Yeah.
so what does that do the same to the beer that is happening in a whiskey in that the beer is now taking on some of the flavor and complexity of the barrel, or what's happening during that time?
Yeah, the main reason for barrel aging beer is exactly that, is to impart certain characteristics from the liquid that previously resided in the barrel into the beer. You can get some beers that are barrel aged where the barrel acts as its own kind of microbiome for, wild yeasts and bacteria to kind of do its thing. But the majority of the barrel aged product we produce at Collective Arts, we are procuring used spirit barrels, so bourbon or rum or rye barrels, and putting a strong beer into there, usually 10% plus, with the goal of imparting some of the flavor of what was previously in that barrel into that beer.
So, if I'm understanding the process correctly, you would have no exact idea when you put that beer into that barrel. You have a belief about what could come out the other side, but you have no exact way of predicting what it's going to taste when it comes out the other end, if I'm understanding.
100%, 100%. That's why, when we do barrel aged stuff, we do barrel aged beers, we do a variety. We put down a number of beers at the same time because there's a blending that needs to go on at the end. When even when we create new products on the barrel aged side, to your point, we have a rough idea of how it's going to taste in the end. We also, the other component of that is we have a rough idea of what the alcohol content is going to be, right? Because we're really not sure exactly how much of that previous spirit was is actually in the barrel, and how much the beer is going to absorb. So there is a lot of unknowns when we do that barrel aging. But like I said, before, we're lucky enough we have a great innovation team at Collective Arts and a ton of experience doing stuff like that. And with the combined experience of our entire team, we usually get a rough idea of how it's going to end up. And usually we're pretty close. The odd time we're not, and we have to adjust as accordingly. But usually we're pretty close.
It's amazing. So there's one part of this whole process that has to do with patience. You talked about that. There is a patient that's required in distillation. But in addition, there is a real powerful beckoning to experiment. If you're not willing to experiment, you're not going to do well in this business. It sounds like this isn't going to work for you. And again, if you're listening in, I always say you're listening in for a reason. And so, what does patience look like in your life? That's a good question for all of you to ask, whether it's in business or in life. And what does a quest for experimentation look like? So often we want things so buttoned down and we're predictable and we're going to know exactly what it's going to look like. Think of how many businesses are predicated on eradicating the experiment. They're all about the predictable, whereas your business is all about embracing the experiment. which maybe more businesses and more people, we all ought to be about that, embracing some experimentation, because some really great things happen when we experiment and then we figure it out as we go. That's a really good life and leadership lesson for all of us to take, I think, in this. How about, I mean, does this work out 90% of the time, 100% of the time, 80% of the time? I mean, how often do you get to the end of the process and say, oh my gosh, that just did not work?
Uh, it doesn't happen very often, but there are a number of instances there are, call it 3 or 4 instances I can think of in my head where, we've got to the end and I'm like, that did not work. Like that was not a great combination of flavors, or like, you'll get spoilage of barrels too. Like we've had, over my career, I've had instances of barrel aged beers, exploding because of an uncontrolled fermentation that happened. And when we package it, there's one or two that I've done that I clearly know. I actually have bottles of them downstairs in my cellar, that just to kind of save as a memento kind of thing. But you get to the end, and I'm like, ooh, that's not a great beer. But it's lucky enough. Like I said, we've done we most of them have turned out quite well, and you learn from your mistakes, and you take those learnings and you translate them to other products we produce.
Now that's fascinating. Like I like trophies to failure
Oh yeah, well that's
in
it,
your
right? It's
in your basement.
exactly. Well, it's what a great example of that, and on the whiskey side of things is, when I used to work at the society, because people always think, the older the whiskey is, the better it is, and and it's always a tale I always tell people of, and it's not always the case. I've tried whiskeys as young as 3 years old and as old as 40. And one of my favorite whiskey, I always tell people, one of my favorite whiskeys of all time was a 4-year-old port finished Bilmore. Beautiful
Uh,
whiskey, had a rose color to it. The combination of smoke and port was like gorgeous. But I've also had a 40-year-old Glenfarclas that was black as tar and tasted like burnt tires. And the only reason and it was a bottling at the society. It was amazing. So this high-end whiskey club has a bottle that had aged too far. And the only reason they bottle it is to show people an example of, yes, you can take things too far here and it gets too old. And it's a good learn, like it's a good kind of teaching opportunity for people to be like, hey, do you want to try like this really old whiskey? It's not going to taste great, but it's just going to show you, hey, like, things can go too far on this stuff. And just because, something claims it's got this certain age or there's certain quality to it does not necessarily mean it's the best thing for you, or it's the best kind of product. So
yeah, so there's a lot of magic in the marketing, I
uh,
suppose, like in all things in life when it comes to these things. So here's an interesting thing for me when we look at this whole process. So there is a part in which this experiment is alive. It's alive, it's
mhm,
growing, it's fermenting. At some point in the process with beer, let's
mhm.
start with beer for a second. Does beer stop its living organic process or does it always continue?
uh beer will not really. Beer is a living thing. Like it'll continue to evolve over time. um uh Even a, a basic IPA or lager over time will continue to evolve based on the components that are there, be it biological or chemical. Like it's constantly developing. Sometimes it's for the good, sometimes it's for the bad. But typically beer, what will happen is once fermentation is complete, or when we want fermentation to cease, we will crash cool the beer. So basically means we'll take the beer from fermentation temperature, which is usually around, call it 16 to 20 degrees, and we'll cool it down to 0 degrees. And what that does is the beer basically, the yeast stops fermenting, um, and it settles out to the bottom of the tank, which allows us to collect it and reuse the yeast. And it kind of puts think of it as almost putting the yeast to sleep kind of thing for a bit. And then depending on the style of beer, or the requirements of the customer, we will either remove as much or as little yeast as possible, and package it as such. And then you'll get secondary microbial activity happening over time.
It's interesting. Now, for those of you who are listening who are not in a country that measures by centigrade, by Celsius, just to be clear,
Yes.
I believe these are Celsius degrees, not Fahrenheit. Just to be clear, because I'm gonna get calls. I'll go 20 degrees. What do you mean 20 degrees? No, this is
Of
20 degrees
course.
Celsius, I
Of
believe we're talking.
course.
Okay,
Yes,
so
yes.
it
I
continues.
apologize. Yes.
Yeah, continues to live, which is awesome. Now, what about so on the spirit side?
Mhm.
So does that continue to live over time, or does it have a place in which it's sort of after it's out of the cask, let's say? So I'm drinking a Lagavulin. Came out at 16 years. Came out of the cask. Now I'm drinking it. Does it continue to live after, or is it dead?
Well, when we talk about spirits, once it reaches the spirit stage, so distillation has happened and has been concentrated. You know, the aging that happens with spirits all happens within the barrel. So when you buy, when you purchase, your 16-year-old Lagavulin or your 25-year-old Lefroy or whatever, um, that's the amount, that age declaration that's on that bottle is the amount of time that whiskey spent in the barrel. And it's the amount of time the youngest whiskey in that bottle spent in the barrel. So with a number of those products like the Lagavulin, um, it's a single malt whiskey, but what that means is that the whiskey that's in that bottle, it's all from one single distillery. It can be from a number of different casks, but it's from one single distillery. So you get a blend of products. So the age deck, so when you buy that 16-year-old Lagavulin, they can have 16-year-old whiskey in there. They could have 18, they could have they could have 40-year-old whiskey in there for all I know. But that age declaration is the youngest whiskey that's there. But no, once it's bottled, there's no real aging that happens.
Okay, so now we got traditional blended whiskeys, and then we
Mhm.
have what we call in this case we have single malt whiskeys. So a blended whiskey. So here's a question I have. I saw a documentary one time, and I was very poo-poo on blended whiskeys for a long time. So, at the height of my collection, I used to collect a lot of single malt. I had about 65 bottles or so of single malt
Mhm.
at one point, which I eventually bequeathed to my son. The funny thing about that is, about 6 months ago, my son calls me up and says, "Hey, Dad, I thought all those bottles you gave me were empty." I said, "They were not empty." He said, the other day I was checking and there's still stuff. I said, "Yes, they're not, none of them were empty when I gave them to you." So I gave them all to him and thought I won't drink as much. I'll collect here and
Mhm.
there, but that doesn't work always
Sure.
great for me. But
Yeah.
I was a bit of a snob when it came to blended whiskeys. And I saw this
Mhm.
documentary on the art of blending, and I was fascinated because I'm like, how in the world can somebody take all of these whiskeys and blend them to a similar profile? Because now they're commercially going out and that product needs to taste similar to the consumer. Oh my gosh, what a complex world.
Yeah, they are, master blenders are amazing people. Like I don't think people appreciate how hard it is to do their job where, you're going into a warehouse and you're picking, there's millions of barrels there and you're picking, 300 at a time that when you mix together are going to give you that, that typical, Bulmore or Lagavulin or Glenfarclas or Auchentoshan kind of character that you want. And it's amazing. Like when I first started down the path that I'm at on the whiskey tasting side of things, it took me a solid 3 to 4 months of, it sounds funny, but 3 to 4 months of really tasting stuff, trying a bunch of things and like thinking about, what am I picking out? Because that ability to taste something and, being able to associate that to a certain characteristic or a certain item in the world is really hard. But then to extrapolate that to be able to taste, like I said, 100 different things, being like, okay, I'm going to combine these all and I'm going to get this flavor. It's unbelievable. They do an amazing job.
It's interesting, I liken it to when I watched this documentary and I was thinking about it, it's almost like an orchestra conductor. They're
Oh yeah.
taking all these different things which have a different complexity, whether musical instruments, and they're conducting them into a certain note. And I mean, and when you hear a great orchestra, whether it's a rock band or whether it's a real orchestra, however you want to look at this, the fact that people can play and there's this sense in which there's all this difference, but it's coming out as one, is a really interesting process. And again, I think this has such a great application for us in life and business because, you're orchestrating this in all these individuals at your company, and you're orchestrating them into this one sort of thing for the sake of the business, the brew, the customer,
Mhm.
the experience. I do that in my business. People do that all the time. We do it in communities, so we have this wonderful diversity and complexity, but yet there's a unification that happens in the process as it comes together. And that's a really interesting thing. And again, if you're listening in, think about how that applies to your world, to your life, to your business, because I think sometimes we can get so locked down in these things that we forget that there is something powerful in being able to blend this diversity into something that comes together. Again, that could be in our community, it could be in our politics, it could be in lots of different things. I think there's lots that we can learn from this world of spirits and the complexity that happens. And I mean, I just find this whole world very, very fascinating to me. And this idea, I mean, the oldest scotch that I ever had was I had a 53-year-old and I want to say it was a Glen Gordon, I believe, and we wet our grandson's head, wetting the baby's head, which is a great tradition with this thing, and
Mhm.
I was like, man, it was so good. Now, I know, as you said, sometimes age doesn't really play a part and
Mhm.
it can be bad,
Oh
but
yeah.
man, it was so beautiful and smooth. But it's interesting. So now I want to talk about this because there's this age-old debate. We're going to talk about whiskey for a second here. There's an old debate here now is so ice, no ice, a little bit of water, no water. So I'd like to understand the science behind using a little bit of water.
Mhm. Yeah, the science behind it really is that there are certain volatiles, certain chemical components in spirit, um, that will dissipate essentially from the spirit at certain alcohol concentrations, right? So, the less water that's there, the more ethanol that's there, the more those components are bound to the spirit. And by adding a bit of water to your spirit, really kind of allows those components to be released, and that allows the spirit to open up. I usually recommend, uh, no more than 20% water to your whiskey. And the other thing I always say is, try your whiskey neat first, so without any water, and then add a touch to it because they are much different. Some whiskeys do really, really well with water added to it. Like Dalwhinnie Distiller's Edition is a great example of that. People are trying to find something that's more a little easy accessible. When you add water to it, it opens up into like tropical fruit, and it's the most beautiful bouquet on the nose. It neat is quite nice as well. It's got a slight sweetness to it, but it really opens up with a bit of water. But then on the flip side of it, Lefroy did I think it was called Calderas or something like that. It was a whiskey they released as part of it was a variation of their quarter cask whiskey they released as part of some festival. And I remember trying that with a bit of water, and it turned into mothballs. It was the most unpleasant thing in the world, which is too bad because I love Lefroy. It's a great whiskey, and I love peated whiskey, and it was just but it was good to know. Some do better, some do worse, and so it's just one of those things. And it's just by it. I always recommend. I prefer my whiskey neat, but usually the first time I try it, I add a bit of water to it, see how it changes. Okay, great, and then I can go back to having it neat. So.
That is interesting. And again, what I heard about this, and I'll test this theory. My wife and I did a bourbon distillery tour at Elijah Craig in
Mhm.
Louisville, Kentucky, a number of years ago, and great tour. And then we got up to they have a beautiful sort of 1940 bar that you go
Mhm.
into. They've done a great job with this. It's just beautiful. And you
Mhm.
go up, and so the master distiller comes and does this sort of tasting with you.
Mhm.
Great job, all good marketing, good theater, and they give you two glasses of the same bourbon, exactly the same. And what he does is he says, "Okay, drink this. Take a drink here, and have a drink of that
Mm.
one. Neat." And then he takes a dropper and literally introduces 3 drops of distilled water
Yeah.
into it, and then taste it, and it's a different drink. Now,
100%.
his science behind that was, which is
Mm.
interesting. And probably you talk about being bound to the spirit. He
Mm.
said what happens is that water, just that little bit of water, breaks the surface tension in
Mm.
that drink and just releases the flavor. And it was amazing how different it smelled just
Mhm.
by introducing 3 drops of water. I couldn't believe it. And so again, this is interesting because I think this speaks to me a little bit also in my own life is, sometimes we've got to sort of break the tension that to release the flavor in our own life. Sometimes there's
Mm.
tension in our psyche. Sometimes there's tension in a lot of things. We got to break some tension to release flavor to make it more flavorful in our lives. And this is again why maybe it's I overanalyze these things, Matt, because I have to justify my own Scotch drinking. But this whole world is so fascinating for me, and I wish some days every once in a while I would like this kind of job. So how does a guy get a job like Matt's job? I guess I got to go to school. I guess I got to get a master's. I got to be a microbiologist. Man, oh man, I don't think I'm having this job, Matt.
It's I always remind myself I'm very lucky, I'm very blessed to be in the position I'm in. I love what I do every day. I love to be able to tell people what I do every day. It's a lot of fun. It's a
It
lot of
is.
fun, and I am very lucky. So,
It is pretty cool. I had a buddy, a good friend of mine. His son was he was a spirit reviewer for a magazine in the U.S. for years called Uncrate.
mm,
So people from around the world sent him spirits and he would drink them and review them. That was his job. Okay. Talk about the best job ever. I mean, that was
that's
his job.
amazing.
And every time I would go down to where he lived, and he ran a bourbon tasting business, like you
Mm,
run a Scotch tasting, but he ran a
mm,
bourbon tasting business. And he also got well known to have a good nose. And so he got involved and was able to at times choose special casks for some of the big distilleries and the big heavy hitters in
mm,
Kentucky. So, this is a very fascinating industry. So, listen, Matt, I love the conversation, and we're gonna bring it in for a landing. But
yeah,
before I do that, so you and I met at this charity event. I bid on, this came. We were there. I didn't know what was coming. There was that auction,
mm,
not silent, which was good. There was an auction for this event, and you got up and you sort of did your marketing spiel about, hey, you want to buy this thing, and so I enjoyed my opportunity to bid on this thing and to support the local charity. But now we're coming to a point where we're going to have this event, and I'm looking forward to having you at my house. So listen, if
mm,
you're listening here now, listeners, this is what you need to listen into. So what's going to happen is on August 22nd, 2025, so in about a month or so from the time you're hearing this episode when it releases, Matt's going to be at my home in Kitchener, and we're going to have a private Scotch tasting event for myself and 19 other people. I'd say 19 friends, but I don't have 19 friends. So 19, I'm going to say 19 other people. And I have left open 2 seats at this event. And the reason for that is that I'm always interested in meeting new people and having a drink with them. So, you listeners, you're listening in. If you are in the general area and want to drive here, now I want to make a caveat. If you drive here, you might have to stay at my house. No, you won't have to do that, but you might need an Uber. Okay, it's just to be clear because we want to be responsible. But I am going to give away 2 seats to that event, to that experience at my house. And so here's what's going to happen. So you're either going to call me on my mobile number, which I'm going to give to you right now publicly. Okay, I'm going to give you my mobile number. So you're either going to call me or you're going to DM me or you're going to email me at tim@uncommodified.com, and you're going to tell me why I need to meet you and why whiskey is your drink of choice. So that's the challenge here. And then we're going to take whoever calls and I'm going to write down their story, and then my wife and I are going to decide who gets to come and we'll notify you. So, if you want to call me, my mobile number is 519-497-2255. That's 519-497-2255. or DM me any social media platform that you follow, or email me at tim@uncommodified.com and tell me why you should be part of this event with Matt and my 19 other people, not all my friends, because I don't have that many. Now, just to whet your appetite a little bit, Matt, I told you about this, but I'm going to do the big reveal here. So there is a scotch that we tried to get, my son and I tried to get when we went to Isla, and we couldn't get it. It was too hard to find at the time, and we didn't have time to hunt it down properly. Because Brookladdick, which is the distillery that makes this scotch, was closed during the time we were there for renovations. And so this scotch is called, and I'll put it here on the YouTube channel, Octomore. And Octomore, I'll put it that way so you can read it. Octomore is, I think, considered the most heavily peated scotch that you can buy. Is that correct, Matt?
That is definitely correct.
Yes. And Octomore, I thought it would be easy to get a bottle of Octomore when I came back in 2021. It took me 3 years to finally find a place because it's sold by allotment. It comes by special allotment across different markets. And I found a wonderful spirit retailer in Saratoga Springs, New York, where I have a customer, and they get allotments. When I first approached the guy, he said, "Look, I haven't had that in 2 years. I don't know if I could get it." He actually called some people, and the next time, every time I gone now for the trip, he has Octomore. So I have bought several bottles of Octomore in the past, but when I was at my customers a couple of months ago, I bought this bottle of Octomore. It is Octomore 15.3. So they do every year, they do 3 releases, I think. And this is 15th year. This is 15.3. So for those of you who are into peated scotches, let me just explain what you'll be what you'll be tasting if you choose to taste this, because it's not for everybody. I'm going to keep this. I'm not going to open it, and Matt's going to use it as one of the bottles that he's going to give us some tasting of. So this is 307.2, Matt, on the ppm scale. Okay, so ppm scale is what? Peat per
Parts per
peat
million.
parts per million of peat. Okay, so it's 307. I believe that Lagavulin is about 47 or so. Okay, so
Yeah.
this thing's got some heat peat on it. Now, in addition, they bottle this always, I believe, at cask strength. So this one particularly is not only 307.2 on the peat meter, it is 61.3% alcohol.
Yeah.
So this is not everybody's dram. Let me put it this way. So just not to scare you away, still call me 519-497-2255 or email me at tim@uncommodified.com or DM me if you want to come to Scotch tasting. Matt's going to bring some bottles as well and all the glassware because that's his business. So Matt, quick question. If people wanted to get a hold of you and get you to come to their private event and do some Scotch tasting, how would they find you, by the way?
Easiest way is to email me at saint.howell@gmail.com. That's probably the easiest way. You could find me on LinkedIn as well, or the various other social media platforms. But the easiest way, if anybody wants to do a Scotch tasting themselves, or host a Scotch tasting themselves, or even just have questions about Scotch, or a bottle to buy, saint.howell@gmail.com.
Okay, so that's saint.howell, Howell, @gmail.com. Or you can call me, email me, and you can be one of our guests. And when Matt comes to my house and we have this great tasting. Now, just so you know, Matt, my wife is going to do a charcuterie board. She's got some chocolate she's working on. She's doing some research about what kind of good goodies should go with Scotch. So it's going to be a great night. And thanks again, by the way, for supporting the charity through this event. It was a great opportunity, and I am looking forward to having you at your house. And again, if you're listening, Uncommodified Tribe, listen, stay uncommodified. All right, drink responsibly. Let me make sure that we're putting this in. If you're in the Toronto area, Ontario area, Canada area, and you haven't tried Collective Arts beer, you ought to. Great brew, they do a great job. Great supporters of the arts, and you get their beer cans, you put them on your shelf, you're going to collect them forever. And also find a spirit that you love and drink it for the right reasons. And remember that there are lessons in here: patience, persistence, breaking tension for the sake of flavor in our lives. Really important lessons. Matt, thanks for your time today on the show. Listeners, thanks for listening in. Cheers. Have an awesome day. And two of you, you come to my house, but we need to hear from you.